Welcome everyone. Again, as said, I'm Erik Peinert. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University. And without any longer way of introduction, I'm just going to jump right into what many of you may have seen in the news lately. There was a moment of several years under the Biden administration when the American government shifted course pretty dramatically relative to what it had been recently doing in terms of intervening in private markets, and especially when it comes to its most powerful companies. So at that moment, within the first year of Biden starting, a number of appointments were made to the main antitrust agencies, the FTC, the Department of Justice, as well as in the White House, along with a chain of antitrust cases against some of the United States' most profitable, most successful, and largest companies, something that would have been unthinkable 10, 15 years earlier. Likewise, this included some legislative updates and an executive order to rewrite a large number of regulations across the government to reinvigorate competition in the American economy. And there's a way of thinking about this, that this is sort of a matter of personalities. And if you watch the news and you hear people complaining about Lina Khan, you would think that this is sort of about a personality coming in with a different view. And it's sort of a short-term event like that. But behind this sort of event and chain of political disruptions was responding to a much longer economic trend. And that is namely that the scale of monopoly power in American markets and the American economy overall has been increasing for a long time. This is from a well-known paper from DeLucker and Eekhout that shows that the amount of markups, so the difference between the marginal cost of production and the sale price of products on average in American markets has increased by about 60% since 1980. It's a pretty direct measure of monopoly power, more bluntly, like a good measure of how much you're getting ripped off when you go to buy something. But this also isn't something that's universally true across the world. So while concentration and this lack of competition is marked in the United States, so this green line here is showing increasing concentration in the US. The Hirschman-Herfindahl index is a standard measure of concentration. We see that in Europe, which at the red level, red here is the country level, and in blue is the EU as an aggregate, either concentration is falling or not really changing much. Now, as a good scholar of comparative politics, I could tell you a comparative story. The United States has these sorts of politics or institutions or ways it deals with these things, and Europe has this other thing, and that's how we explain those differences. But I'm not going to do that because the interest in this project and this book is a recognition of a longer pattern that divergence sort of takes place within. And that is that across a number of advanced industrialized democracy, there's a tendency for policy to alternate in the long run between periods of time where there is systematic support for reinforcing market competition and alternated with other periods of time where the monopoly power and profitability of the largest, most dominant firms is actually actively defended by state policy. This is just a visual representation of that in general, but just to give some orientation and go through the cases I'm going to talk about today. Most well known, the United States introduced its original antitrust laws in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then from the 1910s through most of the New Deal, the US turned to a system of cartel-like industry association policies to restrict competition before turning to active trust busting late in the New Deal, a set of policies that continued through the 1970s until the late 1970s, early 1980s. American antitrust policy was dramatically scaled back in a range of ways. Intellectual property rights, which temporary monopolies were expanded, etc. And this little red thing on the right is the Biden administration's turn back. If you are thinking, what about now? Hold your horses, you have a point. We will come to that at the end. For the other case we're talking about today, France, like most European countries at the time, actively supported cartels during the interwar period as a way to stabilize the volatile markets at the time. And then for about 20 years after World War II, France used a range of atypical policy tools to discipline its domestic business through competition as a means of modernization. Then, in the mid-1960s, turned to a very explicit policy of corporate consolidation in order to increase profits, before again in the mid-1980s shifting back to support standard competition policies. France's policies have sort of been incorporated into the overall European Union's approach to competition policy at this point. So the question that I'm addressing with this book and hoping to answer for you today is, why do we see these alternations in the long run between systematic support for competition and systematic support for market power? To give you just the headline version of this argument, the argument that I'm going to put forward today is that these policy regimes, these periods of time where policy consistently supports one or the other, generate diminishing returns. They undermine themselves over time by creating concrete economic costs the further they are pursued. Politically, however, having pursued policy for decades, there are cadres of political officials and staff and bureaucrats who are committed to that approach to policy. And it's only as those people are replaced through turnover that newer officials who are not committed to the policy regime are introduced. They're willing to learn about what the costs of that policy regime are and switch to support policy in the other direction. I do, however, at the upfront, want to be clear about what I mean by this, because words like monopoly and competition have a lot of meaning. I just want to define what I'm saying. When I say competition, I mean price competition narrowly from the most classic microeconomic models that you've thought of. In a market, there are plenty of buyers and sellers, and producers face profit maximizing incentives to reduce their prices towards the marginal costs of production. When I say market power, I mean basically any way that a producer can avoid that. This could be a cartel, collusion between competitors to keep prices high or output low. This could just be because of concentration, a literal monopoly or only two firms or something like that. There's also a range of regulatory ways you can protect firms from competition. Tariffs, for example, also do this. But I'm defining these two terms in reference to each other. Likewise, although I'm going to talk today, and the book has a lot to say about antitrust policy, this is something that happens across any government. Competition policy is obviously the most relevant area, but there are tons of ways to either make firms have to compete with each other more or less. Intellectual property rights, like a patent, are very literally temporary monopolies. Likewise, this can be done with trade policy through tariffs, industrial policies, tax advantages can keep more firms afloat to compete, or, sort of force the market to consolidate. And when I'm saying that a policy is either in favor of market power / monopoly or competition, I'm referring to the intent of the people who designed the policy and put it into place. That's just really to flag with a footnote that there are some rare instances where policy had, in fact, the opposite effect. But, in aggregate, in the long run, that's generally not the case. And so lastly, this thing that I'm trying to explain, these long-term alternations, I am trying to explain a policy regime, a period of time where governments continuously add more policies in favor of one or the other. To be clear, so what I'm not saying is that, say, the United States set up a policy regime in the early 1980s and we've just had that since. No. Empirically, in fact, it is the case that governments tend to keep adding policies that are more and more in one direction over time. Maybe somewhat surprising in the abstract, but that is empirically the case, certainly across the 5 countries that I showed you about. That was a lot of detailed stuff about what people think, what they believe, how they learn. And so just to make sense of where I'm getting this from and how I'm going to support it, I want to be clear that I got this from a lot of archival research in both the United States and France, about 100,000 something pages, at least that I read, probably more than I looked at. Methodologically, however, this is important to support this argument for a couple of reasons. Most centrally, this is really one of the best / close to the only way to know what policymakers actually knew. What information did they actually have? I'm going to be able to show you some figures and charts and whatnot that they were actually looking at these moments of uncertainty as they changed their mind. What actually convinced them? Likewise, the paper trail lets you see what these internal policy debates actually look like. There are times when there are public debates that everybody thinks were really politically influential, and they do not show up in the internal record as policy debates are had within government. And it's pretty easy to say that that public debate was sort of an aside if it just doesn't show up in the government record. And lastly, archival records let you sort of solve this problem of revealed preferences. I'm a political scientist, and we all know politicians have plenty of reasons to lie or misrepresent why they are doing certain things, but having access to either their private correspondence, letters before they were in office, and other such context through the written record allows me to get a much better sense of what they actually thought. Were they doing this for the reasons they gave publicly? And if not, what actually made them want to do it? So with that foundation of this question, overall approach, what I'm arguing, and how I went about it, what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is first start by thinking through some alternative ways you might try to explain this. Some of you may already be thinking some of these. I'm going to go more in detail in that theory, and then go through 2 of the 4 cases from the book. The first is that shift from post-war France, from competition to this national champions policy of consolidation, and then to talking about antitrust deregulation in the United States, which I think everybody's especially interested in now that the tide is turning again. And at the end, then I want to talk about some of the implications for today, especially given sort of the international economy today with Europe, China, et cetera, and with the second Trump administration possibly putting a wrench in both this argument and many of the prior trends that we've seen in politics of all areas. So to start, one of the most obvious things that any political scientist should think of is that elections matter. And there's an easy way you might think of that this alternation in policy might be driven by election cycles. Left-wing governments might be more skeptical of big business, conservative governments might be more favorable to it, and you might see policy alternate back and forth through those election cycles. There's a couple reasons that this doesn't really work in this context. One, these policy regimes span many, many, many electoral cycles. Obama didn't change anything in this area. Charles de Gaulle didn't change anything in this area. These happen on a generational scale that goes well beyond any given politician's career. Likewise, and probably more important for this argument, is that most of the core shifts in policy, the moment when governments shift direction, actually happen when a single political party, and very often one single executive, actually changes their mind about what they want to do. FDR changed his mind. The advisors under de Gaulle changed their mind. The Mitterrand government changed their mind. And that doesn't fit with any sort of electoral story. The next one that, again, we are talking about the policy area that is most directly trying to limit the influence or power of the most powerful economic interests in any given society. So we might think that lobbying has a lot to do with this. And yes, Google and others have an army of lobbyists, and they're very politically influential. And in the short term, there are lots of individual policies that happen because of interest group lobbying. In the context of trying to explain long-term changes, it is very hard to explain the long periods of time when governments aggressively enforce competition rules over the howling complaints of powerful business interests. It happens a lot more than we might think sitting here in 2026. And so again, sort of explaining an interest group lobbying theory would need to have a reason why they had no influence during those long periods of time. For those of you familiar with political science, there's also a bunch of arguments that sudden economic or technological shocks can dramatically change policy. Things like the Great Depression, stagflation in the 1970s, or something like COVID might upset existing policy and political coalitions, lead to some sort of reorientation of policy. Likewise, the introduction suddenly of new technologies that people didn't see coming might mean that the best organization of the market is different, and government might change policy to accommodate that. There's a certain logic to all of these things. And in this context, the timing doesn't work. Actually, as Mark said when he first talked about this, a lot of the other things that we think of that are changed suddenly by economic crises don't line up with the timing here. And they don't line up across countries. You'll notice the chart 5, 6 slides ago or whatever, those countries were not experiencing these waves or alternations at the same time, and technology and market shocks tend to happen for everybody at the same time. 1929 was 1929 everywhere. Information technologies were introduced, at least in developed countries, at approximately the same time. And then the last one, and there's a very clear explanation and established argument here, is that new economic ideas and ideologies can dramatically change politics. Changing people's beliefs about how the private market is supposed to be run can make people form new coalitions, establish new institutions, change policy. And in this case, and particularly with the United States, there's an established argument. The Chicago School of Law and Economics in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s dramatically reinterpreted American antitrust and related regulatory areas to be much more forgiving towards economic concentration, scale, and market power. I can't dismiss this one right off the top of my head, and also have to admit the Chicago School was deeply influential. But what the book, I think, persuasively shows, and what I'm going to try to convince you of today, is that these new ideas and ideologies tend to be formed or find sort of a political traction because of the economic circumstances into which they are introduced. They make sense in terms of the world they are in, the diminishing returns that they are in some ways responding to. The biggest thing that motivated the book, however, is that none of these have a way to explain this sort of alternation, the consistent pattern of shifts back and forth that we see in this area of policy and politics. Other than the electoral thing, you would expect new ideas, new technologies, interest group lobbying patterns to be random, or at least not have any sort of consistent pattern like this. Which is what led me to this argument about diminishing returns, because you can imagine some sort of internal way that politics and policy sort of alternates in the long run. Conceptually imagine a pendulum swinging back and forth. But that also requires that I first say, why do governments do this in the first place? Why would you spend 40 years, 20 to 40 years, consistently doing policy in one way? And the explanation for this is honestly that markets are complicated and policymakers like simplifying them, asking people what a specific, should, and this is a technical term, but should resale price maintenance be allowed? Manufacturer requiring a distributor to sell at a given price. It's an incredibly complicated question. Tons of experts have weighed in on it. And across a government, you need a simple way to make that decision. And the circumstances in which governments, whether it's judges, regulators, political parties, politicians, etc., are making these decisions is also characterizes this circumstances that induce what's known as a need for cognitive closure. Namely, in these circumstances, people want to grab on to simplified understandings of the world. Markets are complicated. To dispense with any complications or ambiguities or whatnot to be able to come to a quick decision. So to explain this in the context where a judge needs to decide whether a merger should be allowed, so to increase economic concentration, there are intrinsic trade-offs to this. You have to let it through or not. There's no splitting the cake there. The benefits and costs are incredibly unclear. You're making a bet about the future and nobody knows how it's going to turn out. Likewise, you need to make that decision in terms of deductive categories. You need to decide why you're allowing it through. And you have a limited time period to make that decision in. Judges need to do these things in 2 months. And there is zero accountability for being wrong. No judge ever lost their job because they got wrong about whether a merger was a good idea or not. And so all of these circumstances make all of the people making these decisions want to come to a simple mental model about how competition and monopoly work. And so when I defined competition in terms of price competition, that's a mental model of competition. Prices go down to marginal cost, consumers benefit, output goes up, economic efficiency increases. Competition's great, simple heuristic. Similarly, many of us have heard simplified mental models in favor of market power. Patents are needed to incentivize innovation, or larger scale vertically integrated firms are more efficient at production and thus ought to be encouraged. These allow you to take a shortcut to cut through all of the ambiguities because you don't know what's going to happen. And upon institutionalizing simplified heuristics like this into law, policy, and institutions, you continuously push policy in one direction for a long period of time. And that generates these diminishing returns, the core mechanism at the center of the book. This is based on a premise from a bunch of both classical and contemporary economics and political economy that capitalist markets require a balance of competition and market power. The easiest way to explain this is sort of to describe what happens at the extremes. If you continue pushing for more and more competition, everybody keeps lowering their prices, etc., you end up with very unstable markets. Companies get into price wars with each other all the time. Profits go down. The amount of profits that you have available to invest into further growth are limited. Firms go out of business, jobs lost. And at this extreme, this does happen in some situations. Price wars, volatile markets, etc. So this would be too much competition. At the other extreme, probably more familiar to our current world, monopolies obviously charge higher prices, and that's a thing that's problematic. But it also concentrates all of the profits from those high prices into a bunch of firms that have very little incentive to keep reinvesting anything. They don't have competition. They can just sit on their earnings and continue, racking it up, to put it in simple terms. So in both cases, without sort of some balance of the two, there's a limitation on investment into the future. And the argument is that these diminishing returns build up as policy pushes more and more in one direction or the other. That, however, is not how the politics of this play out, because you might think we could sit in the happy middle and not have this problem. Having institutionalized these mental models and had people spend their careers establishing policy, regulatory decisions, writing books, giving speeches, tying their careers, their professional reputations and relationships to a given way of doing policy, they are psychologically committed to doing this. When adverse evidence that their ideas are bad or outdated come in, they are actually, through an established mechanism of escalating commitment, more likely to double down on their existing way of doing things rather than reconsider. However, newer people, uncommitted policymakers, they're not tied to it. There's no personal attachment to continuing things as they've done them. So as those people are introduced into government circles and policy circles, even if they already agreed with the way policy was working, they're willing to see some of these economic problems, recognize them for what they are, change their mind, convince others that maybe this is a bad idea. And it's as those people convince others, move up ranks in policy circles, and make their case that policy shifts at these key moments in the other direction, arguably to create similar diminishing returns several decades later. Okay, so I've established this question. I've explained sort of why I think other existing approaches don't really explain it, and I've explained the general theory of how I went about this in the book. Now I'm going to start talking about the interesting stuff, which is the actual cases that I think make this case. So the book is based around 4 key moments when policy changed, when either from market power to competition or vice versa. 2 in the United States and 2 in France. At a high level, it is helpful that these 2 countries do not line up in when they did this. The US was at its height of its anti-merger frenzy in the 1960s, right when France decided it needed to dramatically consolidate all of its industries. So it's very easy to point out that this isn't because of common technological trends or because the US at that time is forcing everybody to do the same thing as them, as they are known to do. More substantively, however, the US and France, and particularly over the 20th century, institutionally governed these things in wildly different ways. The US has a very long history of common law antitrust regulated and mediated through courts and litigation. It has never had any formal institutional policies prior to 2022 with the IRA and the CHIPS Act, and stereotypically within political science literature, it's a hands-off, liberal market economy that doesn't intervene much in markets. France, on the other hand, didn't have anything that even any French person would call competition or antitrust law until the mid-1980s. It has a very long history of interventionist industrial policy going all the way back to Colbert before the Revolution. But likewise, in this period, incredibly interventionist economy. Price controls, state-controlled financial sector, 5-year plans for industrial development and long-term investment looks nothing like the US. And so by showing that these dynamics play out in these dramatically different systems, it shows that this might be something common about how democratic governments and capitalist markets interact over the long run. So with that, I want to start by going through this post-war case of France, which may not be familiar to many of you, but it's fascinating. The first is that France got out of World War II in a very odd geopolitical position, a former great power that lost a war overnight and now found itself dwarfed by the new industrial titans of the United States and USSR. It needed to figure out where its place in the world was, and also explain why its decline in influence had happened the way it had. At the moment, some of the socialist leaders of a liberation government came to an interpretation that French business was Malthusian. This has absolutely nothing to do with Thomas Malthus. I could not tell you why they chose this word, but they did. And in the rhetoric of the time, this meant that French business was lazy. They would not seek out new market opportunities. They valued stability over everything else. They would actually go out of their way to protect their competitors rather than take markets from them by underpricing them. And in order to address this perceived weakness and explanation for France's economic backwardness, the French government over the next 15 years introduced a range of policies to discipline their business community through tariff reductions, liberalizations of currency markets, anti-cartel policies, as cartels had been very common in the interwar period. Likewise, most importantly for what's to come, from 1959 to 1963, after passing all of these European treaties, creating the predecessors to the EU, which France had pushed the competition rules into, France actually accelerated the pace of removing tariffs from their domestic market, exposing their business to more competition from their European partners. This was beyond what was required of them by the Treaty of Rome. And this worked, as far as they could tell. So this is a graph from the Ministry of Finance showing that the decline in prices over the 1950s, so from 1949 to 62, of imports and exports. These are the things that would have been most sensitive to those tariff changes. The gigantic spike in 1951 is just a commodity price spike from the Korean War, but you can nonetheless see a downward trajectory of prices, and bureaucrats in the Ministry of Finance interpreted this as these competition and tariff policies working in reducing prices. However, the diminishing returns that I alluded to earlier also came. This is from a similar stack of papers in the Ministry of Finance from around the same time, showing, and this is a mouthful, I know, but corporate savings as a percentage of gross fixed capital formation. Gross fixed capital formation is just a measure of investment, real investment. It excludes things like buying stock or buying real estate, any financial shenanigans. It is plants, equipment, R&D, like vehicles, etc. Real investment. And so what this is showing is that the amount of that investment that was coming out of actual corporate earnings started declining precipitously in the late 1950s. And this right here says need for long-term financing, because they recognized that the corporate sector in France was increasingly not profitable enough to continue making the investments that France's 5-year plans were demanding of them. And in France, this was discussed under the moniker of autofinancement. This doesn't have an exact translation, but it's approximately self-financing. In general terms, when a company earns money, takes that money and invests it back into the exact same company, that is autofinancement. The first group, unsurprisingly, to recognize what I showed you on the previous slide, was the CNPF. Think of this like the Chamber of Commerce for France. They're like peak employer business association, who commissioned a report in 1959 to show that this, in fact, the rate of autofinancement had been declining. They communicated this to the government in 1960 and 61, and the Planning Commission, one of the main economic policymaking bodies, commissioned their own sort of like statistics to confirm this. The previous slides were those statistics. But this information didn't change minds overnight. And the way that this political conflict played out happened along the lines of these established committed policymakers and unestablished or uncommitted ones. Jacques Rueff was a liberal economist whose name was on some of those competition policies a few slides up, who had spent the 50s advocating for more tariff reductions, more anti-cartel policies as necessary for modernization, even in the face of, to his face in meetings, being told there's not enough money for further investment, continued doubling down that tariff reductions and anti-cartel policies were necessary. Compare this to Pierre Massé, who was a civil engineer for a decade or so, before being appointed to be the planning commissioner of France in 1960 by President Charles de Gaulle. It was to him that the CNPF communicated this problem of declining investment, and he spent the next year or two trying to convince legislators and other political officials about the problem of this crisis of investment. The term crisis of investment got thrown around a lot in these years. Or Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who some of you, depending on how old you are, will know as the now former president of France. In the late 1950s, he had just been elected to be a legislator for his home district before being appointed by de Gaulle to be the Minister of Finance. Within a couple months of taking that role, he learned about a lot of these problems, communicated to de Gaulle that we have this crisis of investment. We might need to start supporting mergers, consolidation, waxing up on these tariff reductions in order to increase profitability. When he sent this to de Gaulle's economic advisor outright told de Gaulle, ignore your Minister of Finance because tariff reductions are the only way to control inflation in the current environment. This fight played out for a couple years, but ultimately the newer, uncommitted policymakers won, established in the sixth plan, starting in 1966, fifth plan, apologies, that was an extraordinarily blunt and intentional plan to consolidate every sector of the French economy into just a couple firms. This was done by bulk concentrating government orders as in terms of procurement into a couple favored firms, intentionally to put the others out of business, tax incentives for mergers, and likewise, given that there were many sectors that were state-owned, just directly merging them. Business did not like this. Most of the managers and owners of many French firms felt like they were losing their autonomy as owners of a business and now becoming mid-level managers in a regional plant. So this was actually not something that business liked. But nonetheless, in sum, what we see here is a competition policy regime that has its intended effects, but also generates these diminishing returns. They are recognized by uncommitted policymakers and denied by those who have been around to enforce them, to create eventually a new market power policy regime. And now I'm going to sort of explain the same process playing out in the United States, but in reverse. Through the post-war period, when the United States went from a policy regime in favor of competition to the market power favored one that we've had since until the last few years.
Just stop it.
Okay, great.
There
And one that laid the foundation for sort of the tech giants of Google, Amazon, etc. that we have today. This policy regime got kicked off in 1938 by a massive scale trust busting campaign that lasted through World War II. And many of the legal decisions coming out of that, which were actually ruled on by the very same people who started it, creating a range of presumptions against mergers, against various business practices, along with legislative updates to merger control, and cases, especially against mergers, got more and more aggressive over this time period through the 1970s. This also happened in parallel and was layered with the United States' trade policy that it set up after World War II. Freer trade, consistent tariff reductions, and these were layered with all of these other policies, such that competition from abroad also had these antitrust policies attached to them. So the rules against American firms in competing with a Japanese or a German firm, those also applied in other countries and with respect to the way GE would compete with Sony, for example. And the well-known story of this is that because the US had bombed its geopolitical opponents to dust right in 1945, it took 20 years for those countries to recover. And starting in the 1960s, the United States trade balance started to come under pressure. And particularly by the late 1970s, this competition from abroad was mostly in non-technology intensive manufactured goods. Western Europe, Japan started to make lower value added things, textiles, basic machine tool parts, etc. And the US started importing more of that. They recognized this as a problem at the moment, but the real issue where this came up was with respect to Japan specifically, who in 1966 started running a trade surplus against the United States. Now, the reason this one was much more concerning was because Japan was not competing with the United States in just these low-tech markets. This was cars, chemicals, electronics, the things that were the leading edge of technology at the time. And they were catching up and surpassing the US very quickly. This problem first came to overt discussion during the Nixon administration. And I'm about to tell you a narrative of the Nixon administration that's probably not typical. But when Nixon got elected in 1968, the following year, he appointed a very aggressive antitrust enforcer to the Department of Justice, Richard McLaren, who filed the first cases against conglomerate mergers, set up a division within the Department of Justice to go after patent abuses, business loudly complaining about how out of line all of this was. The Attorney General, John Mitchell, who, yes, I know, many of you know for other reasons, backed up McLaren in this, giving speeches about the need for the anti-conglomerate enforcement, why the merger wave of the 1960s was so problematic and the government needed to crack down on it. And that lasted for a few years, Nixon aides sort of ignoring business complaints about all of these things, until in very early 1961, Peter G. Peterson was appointed to be the chair of the newly created Council for International Economic Policy, out of the private sector. He was a corporate CEO. Then in April of that year, he gave to that council, which consisted of half of the cabinet, a presentation of pretty simple slides, the ones I just showed you, that apparently gobsmacked the entire cabinet and Nixon about the reality that many of them had not been thinking of, that American economic dominance was gone. Trade balances were falling, the American technological lead over the rest of the world was shrinking, and something needed to be done. But most centrally, the conversation that day, and you can go listen to it, it is in the Nixon tapes, took a hard left turn into antitrust, competition, and many of the same policies I just talked about. Peterson in particular, but half the rest of the cabinet, pointed out the Japanese have these gigantic keiretsu firms that the government actively supports to reach scales that American economic policy would not allow them to merge up to that size. American antitrust rules required American technology leaders to share their technology with Japanese and Western European firms, who would then re-import the same stuff to the US at a lower cost. These competition policies layered on top of trade were creating this trade balance problem, as well as the fact that American profitability in the corporate sector had been falling for the previous few years. Out of that meeting, the Nixon administration reinvigorated its antitrust review, coming to many of the same conclusions that the Chicago school did about scaling back antitrust enforcement, but without much input from Chicago schoolers themselves. Lou Engman was just a political staffer high up in Nixon's White House and was appointed to the FTC to continue those policies there. The pattern of political conflict through the rest of the 70s also played out according to this pattern of committed and uncommitted policymakers. Ford got into office at a time of incredibly high inflation, 14% or something when he entered office, immediately doubled down on antitrust enforcement as a way to control inflation, signed many of the last big updates to antitrust law as a result. Outside of political areas, the antitrust profession also experienced people dramatically changing their mind. Richard Posner, as a Supreme Court clerk, anonymously wrote one of those big merger decisions from the 1960s. But by the mid-1970s, in the shadow of all of these problems of competitiveness and trade, had become and shifted to be one of the leading thinkers of the Chicago School, wanting to dramatically scale back antitrust enforcement. Similarly, Bill Baxter, who was a law professor at Stanford University, spent his 60s writing articles on the threat of patent abuse and conglomerates and the problems that the previous strong antitrust policies were trying to address. And by the late 1970s, was a complete convert to the Chicago School. And I put John Shenefield in here just to recognize that the Carter administration did exist. They didn't do that much in this area. You can go read the book to read about why, and it's sort of an interesting story. But they recommitted to antitrust policy, but didn't get much of anywhere. Nonetheless, the moment when people recognized that the world had changed was when Reagan got elected in 1980. He appointed Bill Baxter to be his main antitrust enforcer, who overnight just stopped enforcing a large segment of the antitrust laws, rewrote the merger guidelines to try to actively encourage mergers in the corporate sector in the United States. And the rest of the Reagan administration spent a decade or so lobbying, both in international and domestic level, for the strengthening of intellectual property rights to defend those American technologies that they felt others were free riding on. So, again, we see a competition policy regime. We see it having many of the effects it was intended to, and the diminishing returns, which the Nixon administration initially recognized, admittedly in the context of a trade deficit. We see minds changing and pattern of committed and uncommitted policymakers and establishing this market power policy regime that has allowed consolidation to reemerge again over the last 30 to 40 years. The firms that we now think of maybe as monopolies, Google, Amazon, etc., I could go across industries, came into existence in the permissive policy atmosphere of this policy regime. Many of the things that are core to their business model would have been illegal during the previous era. And so I'm going to close just by recognizing what now? Caught up 40 years, and we are in a different world. And first, thinking across the Atlantic, the European Union, who has for a long time been recognized as having more aggressive competition policies, has been spending the last decade in search of some form of industrial policy or some way to enhance their competitiveness against, at the corporate level, their substantially more profitable Chinese and American competitors. This is the Draghi report from a year or two ago. But one of the main proposals that keeps coming out of these arguments over industrial policy is that they need to scale back the power of DG Comp, the European competition enforcer, to allow pan-European champions of cross-national mergers to scale up against their foreign competition. So in some ways, Europe is at the other end of this conversation than the United States is. Here in the United States, we had this moment under Biden, which I would say is responding to the previous 40 years of policy. But now the Trump administration is in for a second time. And there's a couple ways which you can look at the news and think, well, they've completely reversed course. Probably seen, especially with the context of media, the Trump administration is shepherded through a chain of mergers, which would be problematic under any sort of antitrust thinking. And many of the Biden-era rules got scrapped the instant they got into office. On the other hand, the major update to merger policy was actively kept in place. Most of the major cases against big tech are still on, and the Trump administration is paying costs to keep those going. They lost in the case against Facebook, and they are appealing it. That being said, there's a broader context that this needs to be thought in terms of. Like with many other areas of policy, almost no matter what they are, the Trump administration is a classic case of democratic erosion. This is someone with relatively authoritarian attitudes about how policy and politics ought to work. And there's a long literature about how such leaders, even when they're elected, tend to undermine the institutions and checks and balances of democracy once in power. And in line with that, antitrust is pretty systematically being used as a way to reward your friends and punish your enemies. If I like you, you get a merger. If I don't, you don't. But pulling back from that, let's say for a minute that the Trump administration is not going to succeed in those quasi-authoritarian aims. In terms of the theory I've just presented and the argument, much of this turnover and learning about the conventional wisdom in this area has already changed. Staff in the legislature in the United States, in bureaucracy, in circles in the relevant policy areas, the conventional wisdom has shifted onto this new anti-monopoly approach. 15 years ago, if you went around the hill and said Google's a monopoly, people would have looked at you like you had three heads and asked, what do you mean? Please explain. And now people immediately get it, they know, and at some level they agree. And so if we see a return to normal politics, I would say I'd probably expect the anti-monopoly agenda to be right back in the playbook when we get there. At that, I will close because I have talked long enough, and I look forward to answering any questions you have.
You have the lift mics. I don't have mics. Shepherd, your own.
Brilliant.
You go. You run the show. Go on, Lauren.
I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I really like this book. It's super innovative and like totally up my research alley. So I have a lot of questions about theory mostly and not the empirics. Can you just expand a little bit more on like how you operationalize commitment? Because like in the talk you say, commitment's a pretty high threshold. These people have spent their whole lives, reputations, stake them on this policy regime, and so they're like unwilling to relinquish it. But in the book you list like all these different examples in which someone would be counted as committed, like they debated heatedly, like heated policy, they engaged in heated policy debates, or they wrote a book in favor of the policy regime. And so it's like, okay, exactly at what point do we consider someone sufficiently committed that they can't learn from this policy regime? And sorry, I'll ask about it once because they're kind of related. And so then it's just taking one action, like signaling that you believe in this regime enough to signal this unwavering, lifelong commitment to and an ability to learn. And then secondly, like the whole theory is framed very systemically, like periods of systemic shift in the bureaucracy and politics. But then like the examples are very individual based. And you say we can't look at individual counterfactuals because it doesn't really matter if like a different person is in this job at this time, because really this is about cohort turnover and everything. Mm-hmm. But then empirics kind of do that, like you only really look at a couple people that were in employed positions at one time. And so I'm just wondering, like, what if there were different people with different priors just in those key positions? Like, does the theory still hold?
Okay, great question. So to the first one of like, how do I know or establish or at least empirically identify someone as committed or not? There's no hard line. Like, it's a psychological mechanism. Something might be committing for one person and not for another. The key things, and like, hope I explain this well enough in the book, is that like the big ones are like you publicly like did something for this. There might have been a cost for it. So for example, of like a comparison of things I would consider not committed versus committed that might like seem toward this line, Richard Posner wrote the Philadelphia National Bank decision. It is a very strong decision that's like, if the merger will result in 40% market concentration, it's illegal, full stop, no further questions. But he did that anonymously as a clerk to a Supreme Court justice. People just know later that he did it. That's not commitment. Whereas someone who like comes out and says, this is a problem, you are wrong, I am going to like establish that my public persona is in favor of this position. So let's say Lena Khan in 2019 has written a chain of papers about how much of a threat big tech is to democracy and the American economy. She is at that point committed. Hadn't been earlier, but those are the sorts of ways. It's like, especially publicly, are you connected to it? And like, did you pay costs for it? Like another counterexample would be Robert Jackson gave a speech to 200 people. I take that as a reflection of his beliefs, but nobody's going to hold him to that. And he was just talking. The second one was the question of like, am I really making individual counterfactuals? Because both in the book and here, like I talk about individuals here. And I am, in terms of the theory, not saying that the individuals are actually the key variable here. It is the fact that they are reflective of changes in beliefs. And the key here is that, yes, in any individual circumstance, different person appointed to a position, they would have done some things different. But all of that is happening in the context of an economic overhang where these problems keep happening, the conversations keep coming up because of them, and people would have eventually reached similar or the same conclusions. So in some of these cases, I am able to track, even though people didn't talk to each other or know each other, different people in different parts of the government or policy circles come to similar conclusions because of the same sorts of information. And so while the individual level, because this is a very elite area of policy, is fundamentally where people change their minds, showing that it happened independently in a bunch of cases like helps establish that it wasn't because that person had these sets of beliefs. Yes.
Oh, we do have mics.
Nice.
Sorry. Thank you. So maybe this is great. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. So I think in your literature review, you say that a lot of these changes happen because leaders change their minds.
Yeah.
But in theory, at the bureaucratic level, it happens mostly as a result of like policymaker rotations, right? So I guess in a way, my question is, why can leaders change their minds, but policymakers often don't and can only be rotated out of their stuff? If that question makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, the question makes perfect sense. So you'll notice that like I am pointing to circumstances where there's like a rotation of advisors, even though the leader above them didn't change their mind. Why are they able to, especially if they'd like previously supported these policies? So there's a couple things here. One, a president has 3,000 issues that they need to deal with at a given time. Same with a prime minister, anyone sort of at a high level of policy. They delegate things to someone else and only rarely really delve into it themselves. Ford delved into it, gave speeches, went and fought on Capitol Hill for certain policies. But otherwise, a lot of these policymakers don't put much behind the details of these, or the presidents at the executive level don't put much detail behind it themselves. It's the level of advisors that it's happening. But moreover, to your point, I was saying that really at the level of electoral politics. It's not the election happens and then new policy changes as a result. So the change in the 1930s was within the Roosevelt administration. The change in both French cases, like that shift with planning, Charles de Gaulle was president that whole time under center-right governments, similar with the socialists in the 1980s. And it may seem like Reagan is sort of an example, counterexample to that, but a lot of the big changes actually happened in the courts and in enforcement agencies in the late 1970s, even before he got into office. I know that second part's tangentially connected, but not exactly your question, but I hopefully addressed that.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, thank you. So I guess it's just leaders are less committed often than a lot of their advisors.
Less involved.
Okay,
Yeah.
oh, great. Thank you.
Finding instances where the president weighed in detail is not common. Yes.
A great talk. Extremely thoughtful. Just to echo his observation, I'm trained a scientist. So seems like your talk say a domestic or national monopoly politics is a natural response to the use of international or foreign competition.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true? Is that what you have found out?
Two ways I can answer that. And like, there's some truth to both.
Okay.
In general, it is a thing where you will find in many cases where there's like a sudden influx of competition from abroad. Governments will be more like willing to defend their domestic industries. Like protectionism is a response. And sometimes that is through cartels. Like that's what happened in the interwar period across the world. On the other hand, some of what I'm saying here is that the availability of international competitors to enter the market happened because the government had intentionally removed a lot of those barriers to trade. Direct tariff reductions, the US's layering of those tariff reductions with a group of technology and antitrust rules, all of which were intended to increase competition. So, well, yes, the like consolidation policies are a response to that, but they're a response to an economic world that policy brought into being. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, my final question, does this kind of response eventually work? I mean, in the long term, for nation, for globalization economies?
Could you clarify a little bit on what you mean by this kind of
You
response?
know this trend, no. And actually, the speaker last week, Aswar Prasad, talked about globalization competition, right? And he portrays like a doom loop. I don't know when you read it, but it seems like in the end, he portrayed it leads to a vicious downwards trend for world economies.
So I'm not familiar with that argument. In terms of making sense of this, in terms of like globalization, I will say, as the world gets more interconnected, more interdependent, and especially now that tariff barriers, save for the last few years, are mostly gone, there is a point where the number of jurisdictions who have policy autonomy to control these things on their own, to have a large enough internal market that they can set their own rules and not have to follow their neighbors, that number of countries that can do that has gotten smaller and smaller. Like France can't do this independently anymore. Very few countries in the global south can. Frankly, the three jurisdictions in the world now that really matter for this sort of policy areas are the US, EU, and China, and like to a much smaller degree, Japan. Everybody else is like interdependent enough at some way and dependent in so many ways on interconnected supply chains that they don't have their own internal market, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. I have a question about your framing and your alternative hypotheses, because after hearing the talk, those hypotheses, except for the electoral one, don't really sound as alternatives, but like your theory sounds like a clever, like, and convincing mix of all those arguments. So your story is basically there is an economic problem, which in part comes from global shocks to, I mean, France in the 80s, the Mitterrand response was like to a global shock. And also the Japanese shock. Maybe they're not shock, but like global changes. And then you have some policymakers that try to continue the status quo, others that try to do something else, bring up new ideas, which may not be a full-fledged theory, but still different ideas, right? And try to devise something else. So that pretty much sounds like a very localized version of Blythe 2002. So I would like to hear more about like where you see the contrast between your approach and the more ideationalist works.
No, it's fair enough. Okay, so like great question. And like I can go back, like, no, that's gonna take too much clicking. So like I established these alternative explanations, and I was like, there's one way of reading the way I'm saying those as alternatives is I am arguing that interest group lobbying doesn't matter or that ideas don't matter. Not really what I'm saying. I'm contrasting those in terms of the grouping of theories that would say you explain this change in terms of ideas as the primary mover, the primary driver, or interest group lobbying patterns as the primary driver. At an empirical matter, interest groups matter, people have ideas, it affects their behavior and whatnot. So yeah, while there are some variables from those theories that I'm pulling in as part of mine, as alternatives, they are framed in terms of the grouping of theories that centers around those things more exclusively. So I think it's a fair point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Milena thought to it.
Sorry, just also the ideational literature you talk about, a lot of it's quite old, like not to be like it's about paradigm change and things, whereas like, you know, the discursive institutionalist stuff and post-discursive institutional stuff looks more at like the role of bureaucrats as idea carriers, idea agents, and like battles between bureaucrats and translating ideas. So I guess like could you paint this more as like building on that approach to ideational theory instead of the older kind of big changes in that and knowledge community ideas influence policy?
So yes, I certainly could have like framed this in terms of those arguments. I think one of the reasons why I didn't choose to in this book is that literature spends less time attaching the like discourse and the like discursive ideationalism to material effects on the ground. By the nature of what it is, it tends to want to not dismiss, but downplay the importance of material events and learning in the way that some of the older institutionalist stuff has more of a hook to be able to connect it to material events. That's an overgeneralization, but that's generally why I grouped the theory the way I did.
Go ahead.
I've heard this. I'm a little skeptical about Trump and dictatorship. I've heard Republicans compared to Hitler since Reagan. I've heard Republicans called despotic since Nixon. So put that aside for a moment. I remember some of these things because I'm old. I remember a dot-com boom and a bust under Clinton. And I remember him being very favorable to financial companies that are into banking and that sort of thing, financial managers. I remember a crash happening at the end of the Bush administration, the housing market, and Obama using that as a justification for taking control not only of the banking industry, but also car industry, I think TARP loans. So there seems to me to be, they do change their mind, but not in a vacuum. They see something that's a crisis. They respond to the crisis by changing direction. And then it goes on until there's another crisis. And then they hit that crisis and they change direction. So at one point, the Democrats are very pro, it's just usually they're anti-business, they're very pro social media companies. Google and Amazon, they're donating money to the Clinton administration. He's having these $10,000 a plate dinners for Fidelity people, for financial advisors as well. Also with the education industry. So might this be more driven by crises? This is why it doesn't follow elections, but it follows the crises that happen maybe in the middle of a term where our president's responding to that and trying to use his executive power, whatever he has to do.
So in terms of fundamentally, is this driven by crises?
Correct.
And again, in terms of the presentation, there's only so much detail I can go into in each of these, but to go through some of the cases to explain why in the book, I go into more detail to dismiss that. FDR got into office 3 years after the Depression started. He spent 5 years in the core chain of advisors under him, trying to further restrict competition, seeing cutthroat and race to the bottom competition as a driver of the Depression before he switched to trust busting. It happened in the context of a crisis, but the crisis doesn't really explain the timing of it. It was a delayed reaction of 9 years. And in other cases, you could say 2008 was a crisis, but the U.S. didn't turn to its newfound anti-monopoly policies until 2021. And the minds only changed well after most of the economic recovery had happened in 2015 and 16, when some Obama advisors started thinking that maybe they'd messed up the antitrust thing.
There's another book called FDR's Folly. The crisis he's responding to 9 years later is the crisis he's caused by his policies, which have failed. So he's changing a direction in another way. He's responding to the problems that he's causing.
And depending on what you're talking about, sure. But I think some of my argument is that, in fact, yes, the NRA, and again, it's a case I haven't discussed today, but the National Recovery Administration did not work. It caused more problems than it did. But my point in this argument is that the NRA followed a policy model that had been around for 15 years under Republican administrations before it and was simply accelerating it. And yeah, it failed, and it led to many of the reasons why FDR changed direction.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Time for one more. Who wants it? No one? Then we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.